Hi, Living Earth. Today we're going to talk about the flow of matter and energy through ecosystems. So to remind you what an ecosystem is, it is any living and non-living thing, so all of those in an area that interacts with one another. So in this image over here, we see that the entire ecosystem is pictured. We have a bunch of living and non-living things within that ecosystem that are all interacting with one another. Some examples of the non-living things would be the rocks, the air, the water. The living things might be plants and animals / any bacteria or anything like that that's located within that ecosystem. So that should be reviewed. You should already know what an ecosystem is. But a little bit more information about them. Ecosystems are considered what we call open systems because energy and nutrients are moving into and out of ecosystems all the time. So if that wasn't happening, we would refer to it as a closed system, but ecosystems are always open. They could be really big or really small. Ecosystems vary in size constantly. The number of species in an ecosystem is considered a measure of that ecosystem's biodiversity. So in the last set of notes, I went over what biodiversity was, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on it. And then also, just to remind you, the role that any particular organism plays in that ecosystem is referred to as its niche. Okay? So, new terminology now. What are autotrophs and heterotrophs? An autotroph is an organism that makes its own food, otherwise known as a producer, because it produces its own food. So an example of that would be any plant is known as an autotroph. A heterotroph, on the other hand, is an organism that can't make its own food, so it has to consume it. It has to eat food. Any animal would be an example of a consumer or a heterotroph. Okay? There are interactions between species in ecosystems constantly. We have competition, which I've talked about before, which is when two or more individuals or species compete for the same resource. So that could be food that they are competing over. It could be water they're competing over. It could be space or shelter. It could be the chance to mate with somebody in their particular ecosystem, and obviously that's between the same species, but competition over any resource. We have predation, where one species, the predator, is going to hunt and kill the other prey species, which is pretty common. You should be familiar with predation already. We have parasitism, which is when one parasite species is going to benefit at the expense of some other species, which is known as the host. So an example of that would be a tapeworm living in a dog's intestines, absorbing its nutrients. If you've ever seen a picture of a tapeworm, they're kind of gross. They live in your intestines. They're really long and sectional. And they just absorb nutrients. They steal those nutrients from the host until eventually what a tapeworm does is, if they're left in there long enough, they'll burrow through the intestinal wall, and it's not pretty. We have commensalism, which is a unique relationship where one organism is going to benefit from the relationship, and one organism is going to remain entirely unaffected by the other organism's presence. So good examples of commensalism would be when birds nest in trees. They build their nests, they get shelter from the tree, they have a place to raise their young, etc., but the tree remains entirely unaffected. Like, the tree doesn't survive better when there's a bird in it versus when there's not. Or the shark and the remora fish, you've seen those pictures of sharks where they're swimming along and there's a tiny fish attached to them. That tiny fish is gaining nutrients from essentially attaching itself to the shark, but the shark isn't adversely affected by that. It just hangs out with the shark, and the shark's just chilling, just cruising, just whatever. And then there's a mutualistic relationship, mutualism, where both species are benefited from their relationship. So an example of that would be rhinos and those oxpecker birds. So you've seen birds that kind of hang out around larger species, and they pluck they pluck parasites effectively off the rhinoceros. So those birds are getting fed, but the rhino is getting cleaned, and that rhino doesn't have as many parasites or irritants or whatever all over its skin, and so that's a mutualistic relationship. Feeding relationships, on the other hand, are a little bit different. So feeding relationships refer to how an organism obtains its energy. So a producer or an autotroph is going to produce its own energy using the energy from the sun to do so. So that's going to be plants and algae. A primary consumer, so all the consumers have to eat food, but they differ on what kind of food they eat. A primary consumer is going to eat the producer or eat a plant. They're also known as herbivores. So you all have seen an herbivore before: a cow, a gazelle, a rabbit, a mouse. All those animals that eat plants, those are primary consumers. A secondary consumer is an organism that's going to eat an herbivore or eat a primary consumer. So examples of secondary consumers would be snakes or cheetahs, because they eat herbivores. A tertiary consumer, and that's last on the list, tertiary consumers are sometimes also called apex predators, but they are organisms that are eating secondary consumers. So an organism that eats a carnivore is going to be a tertiary consumer. So an example of a tertiary consumer would be a hawk. So energy is going to move up the food chain. You've all heard the term food chain before. But energy ultimately comes from the sun, because the sun releases energy in many different forms of electromagnetic radiation, and that radiation travels through space and it strikes the earth. And as soon as that happens, the plants are going to absorb that energy. The producers absorb that energy directly from the sun. Okay? Then let's say our herbivore, our primary consumer, which is this like weird, disgusting picture of a rabbit I found. It entertained me, so I included it. That's going to then eat the plants. And thus, all the energy that the plant absorbed from the sun, except for whatever was lost through heat or metabolism by that plant, is going to then move to the primary consumer. Okay? And the primary consumer is going to go about its business and use up some of that energy to maybe grow or whatever. But then the primary consumer is going to get eaten by a secondary consumer. And then thus all the energy that was within the primary consumer, except what was lost to metabolism or to heat, moves then to the secondary consumer, which then might be consumed by my super cool apex predator hawk, otherwise known as tertiary consumer. And so you see how that energy moves all the way up the food chain, okay? But there's other feeding levels that we can talk about as well. We have detritivores, which are going to consume or eat things called detritus, which is dead organic matter or waste that you would find on, say, like the forest floor. So leaf litter and those dead leaves that you see in fall, that would be detritus that the detritivores would feed on. And the examples of them would be earthworms, millipedes, fiddler crabs, things like that. There's also scavengers that are going to eat the remains of dead animals. So over here in the pictures, we have hyenas. They're a scavenger. We have earthworms and fiddler crabs, which are known as detritivores. We also have decomposers, which are going to break down and absorb dead organic matter or organic waste. So a little bit different than detritivores because they don't actively consume it, but they do absorb it. So examples of decomposers would be prokaryotes, which are known as bacteria or fungi, mold or mushrooms or things like that. Okay, so here's where it gets a little bit slightly more complicated, but we have trophic levels, which I already talked about, your producers, your primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers, but moving up the pyramid here that you see is a receding amount of energy, because if you look at each level, we have the sun, which is the ultimate energy source here. And the producers are going to absorb as much as they can. They're going to absorb as much energy as possible and grow as much as they can grow, okay? So let's say that producers get 100% of the sun's energy. They don't, but let's just for argument's sake say that they did. Only 10% of that energy is actually going to make it to the next level. And the reason for that is because plants have a metabolic rate, so they have to expend some of the energy that they're absorbing to survive, to grow, to change, to repair themselves, to whatever they do. To continue to make food for themselves, they have to expend that energy, and it is lost as heat, and you can see that over here. So when an herbivore or a primary consumer eats a plant, it only is going to absorb 10% of that total energy. Okay? But they then also have to do metabolic exercise or metabolic activities. They have to process the food that they ate. They have to keep themselves warm. They have to do all of these things to keep themselves alive. So again, you're losing a bunch of the energy that they consumed. And only 10% of this is going to make it to this level. So now we're down at 1% of that 100% of energy that was down here. Only 1% is making it to this level. Because these guys eat these guys. But again, they have to do their metabolic activities. They have to keep themselves warm and alive, and they have to process their food. So when the tertiary consumers up here eat the secondary consumers, only 10% of the energy in this level makes it to the next level. So now we are at this percentage, okay? So of the total 100% of energy that was down here, once you get to the top level, there's only 0.1% of that total energy that actually makes it all the way up there. Okay, so we can talk about this in terms of percentages. We could also theoretically talk about it in terms of calories. So let's say that there was a total of 500 calories here. Only 10% of it's making it to this level, so you would only see 50 calories at this level. You would only see 5 calories at that level, and you would only see 0.5 calories at that top level. So that's how that 10% rule is going to work. And we will be doing exercises with food pyramids and with this 10% rule, and you'll have to do some of these calculations yourself. Okay, next thing I want to talk about is food chains versus food webs. So I showed you a food chain already with that sun to plant to rabbit to snake to super cool hawk. That was a food chain. So what a food chain really is a linear representation of energy flow from one organism to another organism in an ecosystem. Okay? What a food web is actually much more complicated, and it's also more accurate. A food web is going to give you an accurate picture of how that energy flow between individuals is going, because a food web is an amalgamation, a combination of many different food chains interacting with one another. Okay, so this is another example of a food chain. It's pretty simple: producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer. Snakes, yes, can also be tertiary consumers instead of just secondary. It depends on your food chain. But a food web, on the other hand, might look something like this. Look how much more complicated this is. But looking at it, no one animal only eats one thing. Like a rat might eat one type of plant or several other plants depending on what's available to it. And a hawk isn't just going to eat only snakes. It might eat a mouse. It might eat another bird. It might eat a frog or a butterfly or something. So this is much, much, much more accurate, even though it's much more complicated to look at. Okay, the last couple of things I want to talk about have to do with succession in ecosystems. So ecosystems change constantly, all the time. Communities are replaced by new ones constantly through a process called succession. This is going to happen until something called a climax community is forming. In a climax community, we have a keystone species that is established that's going to have a really big impact on the rest of a community. There's a couple different types of succession. We have something called primary succession, where communities form somewhere that was previously unoccupied. So imagine, if you will, a new volcanic island formed, and then creatures showed up and started populating it. That would be an example of primary succession. The first species to show up in a previously unoccupied area is called the pioneer species. So think about the pioneers that we all learned about in elementary school. They obviously didn't show up to an unoccupied area, but that's the idea you're supposed to get from this, is that they are pioneering the new land, or settling it for the first time. If you have a severe disaster that's located in an area, like a forest fire or something that decimates an entire ecosystem, that disaster can revert that entire ecosystem back to primary succession, because if the forest fire decimates the entire area, nothing's left alive, and then slowly new organisms start to move into it, that will be known as a primary succession. Secondary succession, on the other hand, is colonization of life where it existed before. So that's going to be caused by smaller fires, or a tree falling over, or something small that might displace organisms that are there, but it doesn't decimate everything, and it doesn't kick everything out. Like the tree obviously died, and the animals that were in it when it fell might have died, but now that it's laying on the ground, new animals could theoretically move into it, even though there's still living organisms there. Okay, so here's a nice picture of primary versus secondary succession there. So on the top we have primary succession, and I know it's a little bit blurry, but on the left here, you're supposed to get the idea that there's nothing really here, and then slowly you start to see plants, and then other plants, and then more complex plants, and blah, 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 until you get this, this stable ecosystem over on the right with many different species. Down below here on the left, there's not as many organisms, but there's things that are living down on the left in the secondary succession. But then slowly other organisms move in, and that ecosystem becomes more complex. So that's really the difference. I wanted to talk about sea otters as a keystone species to just give you a better idea of what keystone species are and how they work. So if you look on the left, we see this food web, this aquatic food web, and there's a bunch of different animals here. We see kelps, other seaweeds, we see plankton, we see algae, we see invertebrates, vertebrates, predatory fish, crabs, abalones, sea urchins, bigger fish, smaller fish, a bunch of stuff. But over here, we see the sea otter. Okay, so the sea otter here happens to be at the top of this food web, because the sea otter is going to prey on a bunch of stuff. Keystone species are not actually always at the top of a food web. They could be in the middle. Just in this particular instance, the sea otter happens to be at the top. And it's hard to tell what a keystone species is unless you're actually looking at the environment itself. So here on the right, there's this picture, and it says it's the ecosystem with sea otters on the left and without sea otters on the right. So on the left, you see these big green seaweed plants. It looks pretty healthy. You can't really see it because the picture is kind of small, but there's a couple of fish swimming in the background. And then on the right, the one without sea otters, it's pretty barren looking. Like the plants are still there, but they look really unhealthy. And these little carpet looking things on the bottom, those are actually urchins. And the urchins have decimated the population of the seaweed. So sea otters in this ecosystem are actually controlling the sea urchin population and preventing them from overgrazing the kelp, actually. So that's how they're helping to control and keep this entire ecosystem healthy. So that's how keystone species work. They control other populations and keep the ecosystem functioning well. Ecosystem disturbances are things that, shockingly, disturb ecosystems. So disturbances could be natural disasters or new organisms that are introduced to communities. Invasive species would be my example there. Or it could be extinction or a drastic temperature change or disease, or even human activities can be an ecosystem disturbance. Really anything could be an ecosystem disturbance. So most of these are pretty self-explanatory, but invasive species I do just want to touch on a little bit more. You see this little graphic down here. It's this new species that usually is brought in. It doesn't usually just move into an area by itself. It's usually brought in by humans or by some other animal. And that species is going to survive really, really, really well in its new ecosystem. But the problem is that that new species is going to displace a lot of others. And it's going to survive so well that it's going to start stealing resources from the plants and the animals that already existed in that ecosystem, causing huge problems and disturbing the ecosystem. So one of the most famous examples of an invasive species are cane toads in Australia. So if you're curious about that, I would definitely suggest looking up cane toads and why they were brought in and everything like that, because I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it in this video lecture, but if you're curious, please do look it up. Other than that, make sure that you filled out your note sheet along with this presentation, and that is going to conclude notes for the day.